Hey folks, I'm Jesse with Ponybox Woodshop, and today we're going to talk about different ways on how to edge joint boards as well as how to glue up a nice and flat panel. So I use this process every time, no matter what size panel I'm doing, and it works great. So stay tuned, I'm going to show you how to do it. All right, one of the first things you're going to do on your boards is ensure that both faces are flat and parallel with each other. A great way to do that is to lay it on your table saw bed and then check to see if there's any rocking or if there's any gaps in between. Now I've made sure these boards were milled up properly and both of these faces are flat and they're nice and parallel. So if I flip that board over, you can see there's no rocking and it sits nice, sturdy, and flat on that table saw bed. Now don't worry, if you don't have a joiner or a planer in your shop, you can buy wood already pre-milled. Just ensure when you're picking through the stack that you find the flattest and best boards. Okay, we got our 3 poplar boards here, and as you can tell, they are not to their final width. We want to start with them wider than what they are going to end up to be. And what we're going to do is slide them together, and what you're going to see is that even with just some slight finger pressure, there's a lot of gap in these boards on the glue joints. So on this side, it's a little bit harder to see. It's a little bit down here, but over here, it's a lot wider, and you can't, even with just finger pressure, push those together. And we don't want to just go ahead and throw glue on those glue joints and then put clamps on it and try to clamp that together and pull it. Even if we can, it's going to create too much tension, and we don't want that. We can avoid that, and that's what this process is for. I'm going to go ahead and make a triangle mark just like this, and I'm going to label them so that I know exactly which board goes where. Now at any time I can come back and line this triangle up and my boards will be in the orientation that I want them. Now that our orientation is marked, we can move over to the table saw or joiner, and I'm going to show you a couple different ways to get this edge joint where it's nice and perfect, and when we put these boards together there will be no gap at all. In just about every wood shop you're going to find a table saw, so I'm going to show you how to cut these edge joints on a table saw using a simple sled. If you want to know how I made mine, I'll put a link right there in the corner of the video, but it's just some simple dovetail grooves and some micro jig dovetail clamps. So what we're going to do is lay one of our boards down on the sled and pull it back behind the blade, and then we're going to hang our board off just slightly all the way down the edge of the sled. Now you don't need it to hang over much, but you need the entire board all the way down to hang off the sled about 1/8 of an inch. Then you can slide your clamps over and clamp it in place. Now we can pull it back and take it out of the clamps. All right, now we have one edge that has been cut nice and flat, and I'm going to put a little mark on it right there so I know exactly which edge that I've already cut, and we're going to move on and do that to the other 2 boards. Now we can bring our fence over and stop it at the final width that we want our boards to be. I want mine to be 4 1/4, so I'm going to bring it on over to 4 1/4 and clamp it down. Now paying attention to where I put my mark on each edge that I've already cut, that mark and the cut edge goes against my fence. Now what that's going to do is this cut edge is going to mimic whatever edge is against the fence. And I know this is cut nice and flat because I just cut it on my sled, so I know the blade's going to cut this edge nice and flat and square to the table saw bed as well. All right, with both edges of our boards cut and them all the same width, we can now lay them out and check our glue edges. and they should have little to no gap whatsoever on the edge joints. And I can take my hands and put enough pressure to close any gap all the way up and down those edges, so I know that these are going to glue up great. If you have a joiner, this is going to be the easiest way to do it, of course, and I love my joiner. I bought it off of Craigslist for 400 bucks. It's an old Powermatic, but it still runs great. First thing I do before I use my joiner every single time is make sure that my fence is nice and square, which it is right there, both on the infeed and on the outfeed side. To get a good edge joint on your joiner, you want to make sure the board is flat against your fence and you're having good equal pressure as you push through. Now, one good thing that I like to do is, this is my edge joint, so I know both of these edges are going to go together. So put both of those edges down and flat against each other and run those through at the same time. That's going to give them both equal cuts, and it's going to give you a better glue joint when you go to glue them up. All right, let's say you don't have a table saw and you don't have a joiner, but you have a good router. Get yourself a flush cut bit that has a bearing on the top, and you can edge joint with that. I also use mine for a ton of other stuff, so these are always handy to have around the shop. Now grab you a good piece of plywood or MDF that has a factory straight edge on it, something nice and straight, and then whatever board that you're going to need to put a glue joint on. As the same thing as we did with the sled on the table saw, you're going to lay that board down and overhang just a little bit all the way down. And you can use double-sided tape or clamps to secure this board to the other board in your bench. So what you're going to do is set up your flush cut bit and your router so that the bearing rods on the plywood down below the piece of wood you're wanting to edge joint. And what it's going to do is going to cut this wood to mimic this. The bearing's going to ride on that piece of wood all the way down and cut you a nice edge joint. Now obviously I prefer the table saw or the joiner, but this works great especially on job sites. If you need a board with a good edge joint, it's a great way to get one, or if you just don't have a table saw or a joiner. So this will absolutely do in a pinch. Okay, with our boards edge jointed and ready to go, we're going to move into our glue up stage. For gluing up any panels, I like to use these bar clamps. Now pipe clamps work just as well, but I like to stick to either bar clamps or pipe clamps. The number of clamps you're going to use is going to be completely up to you, but you want to make sure that they're equally spaced across your panel. I'm going to lay my boards down on top of these and see that I can scoot them in just a little bit on the edges and then equally space out my clamps. There we go. And the first thing I'm going to do is do a dry fit and make sure that everything is going to come together okay, that these gaps don't require too much tension to come together, and that I have nothing that's going to go awry once I start putting my glue in and everything is final. With our clamps pulled snug, I like to use a piece of wood to make sure that all of our panel links are lined up. Now I can start applying a little bit of pressure to make sure that all the glue joints come together without having to put too much pressure with the clamps. You don't want to put too much pressure because it'll start to bow your panel. And I know that they're not going to use a whole lot of pressure because we did a good glue joint and they came together nicely just with a hand fit. Now once there's a little bit of pressure applied and I notice that all the gaps in the glue joints are gone, then you want to go ahead and run your hand across the panel, make sure that there isn't any raised spots, that everything is lined up. And you notice with this panel, I didn't use any biscuit joints or anything. With panels this small, I typically will not use biscuit joints or dowels. As the panels get larger, sometimes it's easier to use biscuit joints just to make sure that everything in the center stays aligned. With these smaller ones, you can pretty much accomplish that without any biscuits. And if you feel like any of these edges are sticking up some, a good trick to use on that, and we'll do when we finally put some glue on, is to come in with these F-style clamps and clamp them down on each one of the glue joints on both ends. And what this is going to do is make sure that both pieces of wood are even. And there we go. With no glue, just a dry fit and very little pressure with any of the clamps, this panel is nice and flat and there's no edges. It's going to require little to nothing after glue up to get this nice and smooth and flat. I'm gonna go ahead and remove these clamps so you can see a little bit better, but one thing we can do as we're applying pressure to these panels to make sure that they're staying flat and we're not applying too much pressure, get you a straight edge and lay it down on the panel. And you shouldn't see any gaps along that straight edge if everything is lined up properly. All right, for the glue up, we're just gonna be using some Type Bond original glue. And I have my boards arranged so that I can put glue on each one of the edges. When applying the glue, you want to apply just enough so that it has equal coverage and you get just a little glue squeeze out all the way down the joint. Now I'll apply a thin bead all the way down each joint. And I'll use my super expensive glue spreader to spread the glue evenly across the joint. Sometimes I'll just have to add a little bit more. All right, with glue on every joint, we can now lay our boards back down in the proper arrangement. And I'm just going to go through the same process as I did for our dry fit. Start applying just a little bit of pressure. And as I do, you can see that good, even glue squeeze out all the way down the entire joint. With a little bit of a closer look, you can see that the glue has a nice, even squeeze out all the way across the joint, which is exactly what we want. And we want that without having to apply too much pressure to our clamps. So just to make sure that these are good and straight, I'm going to take a wet rag, wipe off a little bit of that glue right here on the edges. I'm going to apply my clamps on both sides to make sure that these panels are staying nice and flat. Okay, it is time for our panel to come out of the clamps. It's been a few hours. The glue is nice and set up. So let's get all the clamps off and take a look at our panel. All right, so our panel looks good. It is nice and flat all the way across. It's going to require a little bit of sanding, but other than that, it looks good. We'll flip it over and look at the back side. And everything looks good on the back side. Got some dried glue here that we're going to need to take care of, but I like to use just an old chisel and it should scrape right off. All right, folks, our panel is flat, it is seamless, and it required little to no work after the glue up stage. I promise if you use this process, your panels will turn out just as great as this every time. Now, I'm gonna put a link to a video right there. It is for this 3-in-1 table saw sled. It's a simple, but really, really effective sled to have for your table saw, so be sure to check that out. There'll be links to all the tools that I use in this video down in the description section below. Anytime you use those links, I really appreciate it. It supports the channel, and we'll see you next time.